everyone, and welcome back to another video, or welcome if you are new to my channel. Today's story is not a true crime one. I felt like doing something a little bit different this time. I've gone for an alleged alien abduction story. I find the thought of something like this quite fascinating, and I wondered if you guys would too. This is like the OG alien abduction story. I'm pretty sure before this there wasn't really much mention of alien abductions that I'm aware of anyway, so it's a little bit more light-hearted. I just thought it would be a nice change of pace and just something interesting in a different way. So this is the case of Betty and Barney Hill, which took place more than 50 years ago. Also, is Betty and Barney the name of one of the couples in the Flintstones? Betty and Barney Rubble, is that right? It's definitely Barney. That's quite cute. If so, it just occurred to me that that's the couple from the Flintstones. So let's start with who they were. Barney Hill was an African American born on July 20th, 1922 in Newport News, Virginia, and he was the youngest of 4 children. As a young adult, he enlisted in the United States Army during World War II and later received an honorable discharge after completing his service. Following his time in the military, Barney attended Temple University, and he then later married a woman named Ruby, and they had 2 children together. But unfortunately their marriage did not last, and eventually they got divorced. And not too long after his divorce, Barney met Betty Barrett. Betty was born on June 28th, 1919 in Newton, New Hampshire, and she attended the University of New Hampshire, where she earned a master's degree in social sciences. After completing her education, she worked locally as a social worker in the child welfare department and was highly respected within her community. Betty and Barney quickly fell in love and decided to get married. And at this time in history, being an interracial couple was unfortunately looked down upon, so they received a lot of public criticism and prejudice, and it was incredibly difficult for them, but they remained confident in their partnership and deeply committed to one another, and those that knew them never doubted the strength of their love and relationship. After they got married, they moved to Portsmouth, New Hampshire, Betty's hometown, where they purchased a house roughly an hour from Boston, Massachusetts, and Barney commuted daily to Boston to work as a postal worker. In addition to his job at the post office, Barney served on the local Civil Rights Commission, and he contributed significantly to civil rights efforts and received multiple commendations for his work. He was even honoured by the Governor of New Hampshire for his outstanding service to the community. Barney was invited to attend the 1963 inauguration of Lyndon B. Johnson and delivered a speech recognising his contributions within the New England community. Both Betty and Barney were active members of the National Association for the Advancement of Coloured People, known as the NAACP, and were often viewed as trailblazers simply for living openly and happily as an interracial couple. They appeared to be intelligent, well-educated and grounded individuals, not the type that you would expect to fabricate an extraordinary story. So that's what makes this story even more compelling, because they're just not Barney eventually found a scenic picnic area south of the Twin Mountains where he could safely pull over, so they decided to stop and get a better look. They stepped out of the car, accompanied by their dog Delcy. Betty took the dog for a short walk, while Barney retrieved the binoculars they had brought on vacation. Through those binoculars, Barney was able to discern more detail. He described the object as disc-shaped, illuminated by multicolored lights, with rows of bright windows lining its structure. When it seemed to be heading more towards them, they got a bit alarmed and returned back to their car, seeking safety. They drove onto a more isolated road, and because it was narrow and uneven, Barney had to slow down, which allowed the craft to close the distance between them. They observed it flying near Cannon Mountain, hovering above a restaurant and a signal tower. At one point, they estimated the object to be roughly 40 feet long, and it rotated as it hovered. Eventually, about a mile south of Indian Head, the object descended closer to their vehicle. Its lights illuminated their car so intensely that Barney could no longer see the road ahead of him, and he slammed on the brakes. The craft then hovered silently above their 1957 Chevy Bel Air. Panicked, Barney exited the vehicle with a .22 pistol pointing it towards the object. Through the windows, he reported seeing between 8 and 11 humanoid figures looking down at him. He described them as wearing glossy black uniforms with capes. According to Barney, the beings did not appear human. He later relayed this to investigator Walter Webb, who worked with the National Investigations Committee on Aerial Phenomena. Barney claimed one figure remained staring at him, while the others moved to what looked like a control panel. He felt as though the being communicated a message to him non-verbally, saying, "Stay where you are." He also described wing-like creatures unfolding from the craft, glowing with red lights, and a long structure extended downward from beneath it. Overcome with fear, Barney ran back to the car, shouting to Betty that they needed to leave, and they sped off down the road. As they drove, Betty leaned out the window wanting to keep watching the object. Shortly after, they both began hearing rhythmic buzzing and beeping sounds, and they also felt a tingling sensation throughout their bodies. Then, everything went blank. When they regained awareness, they realized that they had traveled approximately 35 miles south She described the craft as flat and pancake-shaped, not like the typical domed sort of shape that we would imagine when we think of UFO. Major Henderson later informed her that an unidentified object had appeared on radar at 2:14 a.m. on the night of their experience. However, in his final report, filed on September 26th, he concluded that the Hills had likely misidentified the planet Jupiter or experienced an optical illusion. But the report was later deemed insufficient due to lack of data. Barney had been reluctant to report the sighting in the first place, likely concerned about public ridicule and unwanted attention. You know, they already faced a lot of scrutiny for being an interracial couple, so I think it was probably just him wanting to lay low. But Betty, I think, felt like it needed to be reported. Returning to Betty's conversation with her sister Janet, she had also mentioned the concentric circles on their trunk to her, and Janet suggested using a compass to see if it reacted near those circles. So Betty and Barney retrieved a compass and began moving it close to the circles on the car's surface, and when they got closer to it, they observed something strange. The needle began spinning wildly, and as soon as they moved the compass away from the car, it returned back to normal. After conducting this small test, Barney became increasingly convinced that something unusual had happened. There was clearly something abnormal about those metallic circles. Betty, meanwhile, felt even more certain that whatever they had experienced was not of this world, that it was likely to be something extraterrestrial in nature. Over the next several days, Betty threw herself into researching UFOs. She visited the Portsmouth Public Library and began reading everything she could find out about flying saucers and reported sightings. One of the books she checked out was Flying Saucers Are Real, written by Donald Kehoe, a retired Marine Corps major and the head of the Civilian UFO Research Group, National Investigations Committee on Aerial Phenomena, also known as NICAP. Kehoe's book proposed that UFOs had been visiting Earth for centuries, and that sightings had increased alongside humanity's development of nuclear technology. It also suggested that the US government was aware of these visitations and was deliberately suppressing the information. For Betty, this material seemed to validate what she believed that they had encountered. On September 26th, Betty wrote directly to Donald Kehoe, detailing everything that she and Barney had witnessed, including the spacecraft and the humanoid figures. In her letter, she mentioned that they were considering hypnosis as a way to recover their missing memories or their missing time. Interestingly, Betty's letter was forwarded to Boston astronomer and NICAP member Walter N. Webb. On October 21st, 1961, the Hills met with Webb and recounted as much of their experience as they could remember. Barney told Webb that he felt as though a mental block was preventing him from accessing the entirety of his memories. And after interviewing them, Webb publicly stated that he believed the Hills were sincere and that the incident likely occurred as they described it, allowing for normal human error in estimating size, distance, and time. However, their ordeal did not end here. Roughly 10 days later, Betty began experiencing vivid nightmares in which she they fragmented memories resurfacing. So in November of 1961, Betty began documenting her dreams in writing. In one account, she described entering a roadblock and being surrounded by small men approximately 5'4". They wore matching blue uniforms and caps resembling military attire. Though somewhat human in form, they had greyish blue skin, dark eyes, black hair, prominent noses, and bluish lips. In her dream, she and Barney were led up a ramp into a metallic disc-shaped craft and separated into different rooms. Betty described being examined by a calm figure she referred to as the examiner, accompanied by a leader. They spoke broken English and informed her that they were conducting tests to compare humans with the craft's occupants. She was placed on a table beneath a bright light, where some hair and nail clippings were taken and her skin was scraped. A large needle was inserted into her navel, causing intense pain, until the leader waved his hand before her eyes, after which the pain ceased. She also described being shown a three-dimensional star map and briefly given a book filled with strange symbols. When she asked where they came from, the leader indicated a map of stars. Later, she was told she could not keep the book because the others did not want her to remember the encounter, which again, this is just all from her dreams, but she believed that they might be memories. On November 25th, the Hills were interviewed by NICAP investigators Robert Homan and C.D. Jackson. The investigators noted that the drive home should have taken roughly 4 hours, and yet the Hills arrived 7 hours later. They also reported being unable to remember a 35-mile stretch along Route 3 between Indian Head and Ashland. At one point, they had seen what they thought was the moon on the road, but investigators later determined the moon had already set. Hypnosis was proposed as a way to recover the missing time, and though initially hesitant, Barney eventually agreed in hopes of easing Betty's distress. They even revisited the site of the encounter, but it did not restore their memories. On November 23rd, 1962, they attended a church meeting where Air Force Captain Ben Sweat spoke about hypnosis. Afterwards, they approached him about their experience, and Sweat advised them to seek a qualified professional and recommended they consult a psychiatrist. This eventually led them to Dr. Benjamin Simon, a respected Boston psychiatrist and neurologist. Dr. Simon initially diagnosed them with anxiety, but decided to proceed with regressive hypnosis to explore their missing memories. Beginning on January 4th, 1964, and continuing through to June 6th, Dr. Simon conducted multiple individual hypnosis sessions, with each of them separately to prevent cross-contamination of memories. Under hypnosis, Barney became extremely emotional when recalling the beings. He described them as being non-human, with large slanted eyes that deeply frightened him. He said he kept his eyes closed during much of the examination. He recalled being placed on a table and having a cup-like device placed on his genitals and a tube inserted into his anal cavity. He believed a sperm sample may have been taken from him. He also remembered skin scrapings and an examination of his spine. He claimed that the beings communicated partly in English and partly in a language he did not understand, possibly telepathically, as he did not observe their mouths moving. Betty's hypnotic recollections were similar to her dreams, but with notable differences in sequence and detail. She experienced intense emotional distress during some sessions, so much so that Dr. Simon had to end one early due to her crying and screaming. During one session, Dr. Simon asked Betty to sketch the star map that she claimed to have seen. Her drawing depicted 12 prominent stars connected by lines and 3 forming a triangle. She described solid lines as trade routes and dashed lines as lesser travelled paths. In 1968, amateur astronomer Marjorie Fish studied the map after it was published in the book The Interrupted Journey by John G. Fuller. Fish created a 3-dimensional model of nearby stars and concluded that the map most closely resembled the double star system Zeta Reticuli. Zeta Reticuli is frequently associated with alleged extraterrestrial beings commonly known as the Greys, the typical small grey-skinned humanoids with large almond-eye shapes that we've kind of become accustomed to picturing when we think of aliens. And the physicist Bob Lazar, if you've ever heard of him, later claimed that in Area 51 there was a recovered craft that originated from Zeta Reticuli. However, many scientists disagreed with Fish's interpretation, and even renowned astronomer Carl Sagan dismissed the resemblance between Betty's drawings and Zeta Reticuli. After months of hypnosis, the central narrative became clear. The craft had blocked the road, the hills were taken aboard, and they were examined against their will, and then instructed not to remember the event. Dr. Simon later suggested that Barney's memories might have been influenced by Betty's dreams. Whilst Barney rejected this theory, Simon noted that although their accounts aligned in broad strokes, certain details differed. Following the sessions, both Betty and Barney appeared less anxious, but Dr. Simon did not publicly endorse the abduction as fact. He stated that either the event truly occurred, or it was a misinterpretation of real experiences combined with psychological factors. And Betty and Barney didn't aggressively seek publicity after this. They mostly just shared their story privately. Although Betty later did become active in UFO circles and reported additional sightings. Barney passed away of a cerebral hemorrhage on February 25th, 1969 at the age of 46, and Betty passed away from cancer on October 17th, 2004 at 85, and she'd never remarried. In later years, skeptics argued that their experience could have been a stress-induced hallucination stemming from societal pressures faced by interracial couples in the 1960s, but Betty rejected this explanation, insisting that their marriage was strong and not a source of significant stress. Others pointed out that hypnosis occurred more than 2 years after the incident, leaving ample time for memory distortion. Some suggested that Barney may have misidentified the nearby Cannon Mountain aerial tramway through binoculars, and other critics noted similarities between their descriptions and contemporary science fiction media. Ultimately, the case rests largely on their hypnosis transcripts and personal testimony. No additional witnesses could confirm their sighting, and the case of Betty and Barney Hill remains one of the most famous and debated UFO abduction stories in history. So I would love to know what you guys make of this, what you think may have happened to Betty and Barney. One thing I did think about when listening to this story is that when it comes to hypnosis, you have to be very careful. I have been hypnotized one time in my life, and it was done by a friend, and she was telling me that when you undergo hypnosis, you have to be very certain and trusting in that person, because the hypnotist could implant false memories into you when you're in a vulnerable hypnotic state. they believed them to be true. They didn't realise what was happening. And so part of me wonders if that could have happened here, although Betty was having those dreams before the hypnosis. But was she just having those dreams because she had convinced herself that this had happened? I don't know. It's very hard to say, isn't it, without being able to visually see what they were seeing. And because of the times, maybe it was some sort of technology that we're so accustomed to seeing now, like satellites and things, or drones, that maybe they had those technologies back then, but they weren't public, and they witnessed some kind of military technology. That's possible, especially out in the middle of nowhere. But yeah, I would love to know what you guys think of this. Do you believe in aliens? Do you think there is other life in the universe, other intelligent life? I like to think that there is. One of my favourite films is Contact, and there's a quote in there that I really like, which is, "If it's just us, it seems like an awful waste of space." And it's true. The universe is huge, and if it's just us, that's kind of depressing in a way. I mean, I suppose it makes us little miracles.